The sound wasn't rain. It was the distinct, shattering crack of ice against 3-year-old wood, a violent percussion that echoed in the pit of my stomach. I stood on the porch, watching the sky tear itself open over the valley. But my eyes weren't on the clouds. They were locked on the solitary figure standing motionless in row 12. Kendra. The woman who usually commanded this estate like a general was standing ankle-deep in freezing mud, watching her legacy dissolve into the soil. She didn't flinch as the hail bruised the vintage into ruin, destroying a year of our lives in minutes. I didn't think about the mud or the cold. I just ran into the dark. The storm was a physical weight, a heavy, suffocating blanket of noise and ice. The wind screamed down the valley floor, carrying the sharp, acidic scent of premature fermentation, the smell of thousands of dollars of Pinot Noir bleeding out onto the earth. It hit me like a wall, cold and violent, soaking through my jacket in seconds. But the cold was nothing compared to the sight of her. Kendra had always been the Iron Queen of the valley. I'd watched her stare down bank loan officers with a single raised eyebrow and negotiate distribution deals that saved us from bankruptcy without breaking a sweat. She was structure. She was protocol. She was the trellis wire that held everything else up. But tonight, the wire had snapped. When I reached her, the mud sucked at my boots, trying to hold me back. She was vibrating. Not shivering, vibrating, with a tension so tight I thought she might shatter if I touched her. Her hands were clenched at her sides, knuckles white against the dark storm coat. She wasn't looking at the destroyed vines anymore. She was staring at nothing, her eyes wide and unseeing, lost in the calculation of a loss too big to quantify. "Kendra!" I shouted over the roar of the wind. She didn't blink. The rain plastered her dark hair to her skull, stripping away the polished professional veneer she wore like armor. She looked younger, smaller, and terrifyingly human in the deluge. I stepped into her space. This was a boundary I never crossed. The assistant didn't touch the owner, not like this. But the storm didn't care about our employee handbook or the careful distance we maintained. I grabbed her arm, my grip firm through the soaked wool of her coat. It was like grabbing a statue. "We have to go," I said, leaning close so she could hear me over the hail. "Kendra, move." She resisted at first, a rigid refusal to abandon the ship even as it sank. Then I saw her shoulders drop, just an inch. It was the surrender. The moment the formidable executive admitted she couldn't fight gravity or weather. She turned to me, and for the first time in 3 years, I saw fear in eyes that usually only held calculation. The walk back to the main house was a blur of physical exertion. The ground was treacherous, a slurry of clay and ice that threatened to send us both sprawling. She stumbled, her heavy boots sliding in the muck, and I caught her. My arm went around her waist, instinctively pulling her weight against mine to keep her upright. The contact was electric, searing through the layers of wet clothes. It wasn't just support, it was an anchor. I felt the heat of her body, the frantic rhythm of her breathing against my side. We were a tangled mess of limbs and mud, fighting every step against the wind that tried to push us back into the wreckage. I didn't let go. I couldn't. The hierarchy of the vineyard had dissolved in the rain. Out here, we were just 2 bodies trying to survive the night. We reached the back porch, stumbling up the wooden steps. I fumbled for the latch with frozen fingers, shoving the heavy oak door open. We spilled inside, and I kicked the door shut behind us, sealing out the roar of the world. The silence of the kitchen was sudden and absolute. The storm was reduced to a dull, distant drumming on the roof. We stood there on the slate floor, dripping water into puddles that darkened the stone, breathing hard. The air here was still, smelling of dried sage and the faint, lingering warmth of the day's baking. It felt less like a room and more like a sanctuary. I looked at her, really looked at her, stripped of her context, shivering in the sudden quiet. The silence inside the house was heavier than the storm. It wasn't empty. It was pressurized. The kitchen usually smelled of coffee and toner, but tonight it smelled of dried thyme and cedar. Kendra stood in the center of the room, staring at the copper pans hanging above the island as if they were alien artifacts. She was shivering violently, a small clicking sound that tore at my composure. I moved. The hesitation that usually defined our workspace was gone, leaving only the immediate imperative to get her warm. I went to the linen closet by the pantry, grabbing the thickest towels I could find, the ones reserved for guests, plush and heavy. When I returned, she hadn't moved an inch. She was a statue of ice and shock, trapped in the center of her own kitchen. "Kendra," I said, my voice low. I didn't wait for permission. I stepped into her personal space, the air between us smelling of rain and ozone. I reached for the collar of her heavy wool coat. Her hands hung uselessly at her sides, red from the cold, refusing to function. My fingers worked the top button, slippery with rain, then the next. The wool was sodden, weighing 50 pounds, a wet burden she didn't have the strength to shed. I peeled it back from her shoulders, the heavy fabric sliding down her arms with a wet slap as it hit the floor. Underneath, she was wearing a silk blouse that was ruined. The water had soaked through the wool, pasting the thin, pale fabric to her skin. It was translucent in the dim light, clinging to the curve of her shoulder, the line of her spine. I saw the violent tremor that ran through her frame, a physical rejection of the cold that had settled in her bones. I shook out the large bath towel and wrapped it around her shoulders, pulling it tight across her chest. I held the ends of the towel, using the friction of the terry cloth to rub warmth into her arms, my hands moving firmly up and down her biceps. She leaned into the pressure. It was a subtle shift, a microscopic surrender to the care I was offering. Her head dipped forward, water from her hair dripping onto my wrists. I was close enough to see the goosebumps rising on her neck, close enough to smell the expensive jasmine perfume she wore, now mixed with the raw, metallic scent of the storm. "I'm going to light the fire," I told her, keeping my voice steady, an anchor in the room. "Stay here." I knelt at the hearth, my own hands shaking slightly as I struck the match. The smell of sulfur flared, sharp and brief, followed by the comforting scent of catching kindling. The flames licked up the dry oak logs, casting long, dancing shadows across the slate floor. The orange light washed over the room, turning the puddles of water into pools of liquid gold. I looked back at her. She had moved closer to the heat, clutching the towel with white-knuckled desperation. The firelight caught the wet strands of hair plastered to her cheek, illuminating the hollowness of her expression. She looked stripped down, the formidable CEO dissolved, leaving behind a woman who was cold and devastatingly real. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the wood. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the stunned silence of a crash site. We were breathing in the aftermath. I knew what she needed. I walked to the wine cooler, bypassing the daily drinkers and reaching for the top shelf. I pulled out the 2016 Reserve Pinot, the vintage that had put us on the map, the bottle we were saving for the 10-year anniversary. There was no point in saving anything for a future that had just been hailed into oblivion. I didn't bother with decanting. I popped the cork, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room, and poured 2 generous glasses. The wine was dark, almost black in the firelight, heavy with the promise of better years. I walked back to the hearth and held a glass out to her. "Drink," I said softly. She looked at the glass, then up at me. Her eyes were dark, dilated, searching my face for something I couldn't quite name. She reached out, her hand trembling as her fingers brushed mine. The contact was brief, but the charge was immediate, a spark of heat that had nothing to do with the fire. She took the glass, her skin cold against my fingertips, and the transfer of weight felt like a pact. We were drinking the past while the present lay in ruins outside. And for the first time, I wasn't just her assistant. I was the only thing standing between her and the cold. She swallowed the wine. It wasn't a sip, it was a dose, a necessary anesthetic administered by her own hand. The liquid was dark and complex. She didn't lower the glass. She held it near her lips, staring into the fire as if the flames could rewrite the last 2 hours. When she finally spoke, her voice was a low rasp, stripped of the polished cadence she used for board meetings and investors. It was the voice of a woman who had been screaming on the inside for a very long time. It wasn't just the crop, she said. The admission hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. She didn't look at me. She was talking to the fire, confessing to the burning logs because looking at me would make it too real. The insurance premiums tripled last quarter. I didn't renew the policy on the vintage. I gambled that the weather patterns would hold. I bet the farm, literally, on a clear October. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach, a sharp counterpoint to the warmth of the hearth. I knew the books were tight. I managed the day-to-day accounts after all, but I hadn't known the extent of the leverage. She had shielded me from the true precariousness of our position, carrying the weight of the debt alone in that expansive, lonely office. I leveraged the deed to the main house to cover the operating costs for the harvest crew, she continued, the words tumbling out now, a dam breaking. If we don't produce a vintage, the bank calls the note in 60 days. It's all gone. The land, the label, this house, my father's legacy. Her hand shook, the wine rippling in the glass, a dark mirror of her internal tremor. I'm the one who lost it. He built it for 40 years, and I lost it in 3. I didn't offer hollow platitudes. There is no, it will be okay, when the math dictates ruin. Instead, I moved closer, my movements deliberate and slow, like approaching a startled animal. I sat on the raised hearth, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from her skin, close enough to smell the rain evaporating from her hair. I wanted her to feel my presence not as an employee, but as a witness, a suture holding the edges of the wound together. You didn't lose it, I said, my voice low and firm. You fought for it. There's a difference. She turned her head, her expression shattering whatever reserve remained. Her eyes were rimmed with red, the exhaustion etched deep into the lines around her mouth. The firelight caught the unshed tears standing in her eyes, making them glitter like broken glass. It was a raw, visceral vulnerability that made my breath catch. The armor was gone. In its place was Kendra, terrified, exhausted, and devastatingly beautiful in her defeat. I'm tired of fighting, she whispered, the confession barely audible over the crackle of the wood. I'm so tired of being the one who has to have the answer. Everyone looks at me and sees the checkbook, or the boss, or the legacy. No one sees the person who wakes up at 3 a.m. unable to breathe because the pressure is crushing her ribs. She took a shuddering breath, her gaze dropping to my lips, then back to my eyes. It's lonely at the top of the hill, especially when the hill is sliding away. The intimacy of the moment was thick, coiled tight in the space between us. I took a sip of my own wine, the taste sharp and grounding. You aren't alone on the hill, I said. I'm right here. I've been right here for 3 years. She studied me then, really studied me, her gaze tracing the line of my jaw, the damp hair falling over my forehead. The atmosphere shifted, the tragic weight of the financial ruin giving way to a different kind of tension, something magnetic and undeniable. She set her wine glass down on the slate floor with a soft clink. "That's what I don't understand," she said, her voice gaining a sudden, intense clarity. "The season was brutal even before the storm. The hours, the pay cuts I had to ask you to take. You have a degree that could get you a job in the city making double what I pay you, with none of this mud or madness." She leaned forward, closing the distance until her knees almost brushed mine. The question wasn't just curiosity. It was a challenge, a plea for the truth. "Why did you stay?" The question was a key turning in a lock. It wasn't an interview question. It was a vulnerability so raw it felt like a physical weight in the room. I studied her, past the wet silk and the shivering, past the title on her office door and the signature on my paychecks. The answer wasn't complicated. It wasn't about the soil composition or the prestige of the label. It was about the woman who 3 months ago had spent 6 hours personally staking young vines in the blistering heat because the crew was short-handed. "I didn't stay for the wine, Kendra," I said, my voice low but steady, cutting through the crackle of the fire. "The wine is just juice. I stayed because I watched you carry this entire place on your back for 3 years without complaining once. I stayed because you're the only person I know who cares more about the living things in the soil than the profit margin." I took a breath, the air thick with the scent of burning oak and drying wool. "I stayed because I wanted to be the person standing next to you when you finally won." The words landed softly, but their impact was seismic. The air between us thickened, charged with a sudden, sultry density that made it hard to breathe. The dynamic in the room shifted on its axis. We weren't boss and employee anymore. We were just 2 people in a warm room surrounded by cold ruin. And the truth was finally out in the open. Kendra stared at me, her dark eyes searching mine, processing the confession. She didn't look away. For the first time, she didn't retreat behind the walls of her office or her legacy. She moved. It was a slow, deliberate closing of the distance, like a magnetic pull she couldn't resist. She slid off the hearth, her boots making no sound on the slate, and stepped into the space between my knees. The heat radiating from her was palpable, a feverish warmth that clashed with the lingering chill of the storm. She was close enough now that I could count the eyelashes framing her tired eyes, close enough to see the pulse fluttering frantically at the base of her throat. "I don't feel like a winner," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I feel like I'm standing in a graveyard." "Then let me help you dig out," I answered. She reached out then. Her hand, usually so sure and commanding, shook as she raised it. Her fingers brushed the line of my jaw, cool and damp, sending a shockwave of sensation straight to my chest. It was a tentative, testing touch, a question asked in the language of skin. She traced the angle of my face, her thumb resting just below my lip, and the contact was electric. It grounded me and unmoored me all at once. The smell of rain on her skin was intoxicating, mixed with the smoke from the fire and the faint, sweet scent of the wine on her breath. "I don't need a business partner right now," she murmured, her gaze dropping to my mouth. "I don't need a strategy or a spreadsheet. I need a reason. I need to know that there's something left in this house that isn't broken." "Kendra," I breathed, the single word a warning and an invitation. She leaned in. The movement was inevitable, a surrender to the gravity that had been pulling at us for years. Her forehead rested against mine, her breath hitching. The tension coiled tight, a physical ache in the center of my chest. I wanted to close the gap. I wanted to pull her into me and erase the last 3 years of professional distance with one moment of reckless contact. The pull was undeniable, a sultry, heavy force that demanded I taste the wine on her lips. But looking at her, shaking, vulnerable, her life in shards around her ankles, I knew I couldn't do it. Not tonight. Not when she was grasping for a lifeline. If we crossed this line now, in the wreckage of her trauma, we could never go back. It would be a reaction to the pain, not a choice made in the light. I brought my hand up, covering hers on my cheek, interlacing our fingers. I held her there, savoring the weight of her palm, the heat of the connection, but I didn't let us fall. I pulled back just an inch, a microscopic distance that felt like miles. "You aren't broken," I whispered, holding her gaze with unflinching intensity. "And neither are we. But we're not going to start this because you're scared. We're going to start this because you want it. When the sun is up and the storm is gone." I woke with a crick in my neck and the taste of wood smoke in my mouth. The armchair I'd pulled close to the dying fire offered zero ergonomic support, but I hadn't wanted to leave the room. The light filtering through the kitchen windows was the flat, bruised gray of early dawn. It was quiet, the kind of absolute, ringing silence that follows a catastrophe. The storm had exhausted itself, leaving the valley battered and dripping. I sat up, wincing as my spine popped. The spot on the rug where Kendra had been sitting was empty. A moment of panic flared, sharp and immediate, before I saw her. She was standing by the French doors that looked out over the estate, wrapped in the same blanket I'd given her, holding a mug of coffee with both hands. She wasn't looking at the view. She was staring at the wreckage of the Vineyard rows, which looked like dark scars against the morning mist. I stood up, the movement stiff and heavy. "Did you sleep?" I asked, my voice rough with disuse. She didn't turn around. "For an hour. Then the silence woke me up." She took a sip, the steam curling around her face. "It looks worse in the daylight. The mud makes it look final." I walked over to the coffee pot where the coffee burgling. She had made a fresh pot. The domesticity of the act, the simple, rhythmic brewing of coffee in the middle of financial ruin, felt intimate in a way that terrified me more than the storm had. I poured a cup, the ceramic warming my cold fingers, and joined her at the window. I didn't stand behind her. I stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder, a united front against the view. "It's not final," I said, looking at the stripped vines. "It's just a reset, a brutal, expensive reset." She turned to me then. The darkness under her eyes was pronounced, bruising the delicate skin, but the frantic vibration from the night before was gone. In its place was a cold, hard resolve. She looked at me over the rim of her mug, and the memory of her forehead against mine, of the heat that had almost consumed us, passed between us. We didn't speak of it. We didn't have to. It was there, woven into the cadence of our breathing, a secret hum beneath the floorboards. "I went over the numbers while you were sleeping," she said, her tone shifting to a softer version of her professional voice. "If we liquidate the reserve stock and sell the unplanted acreage on the North Ridge, we can cover the loan interest. But we can't afford a crew for cleanup. We can't afford the replanting labor." "You have a crew," I said. "You have me. You're an assistant, Garrett, not a field hand. I'm whatever this place needs me to be." I set my mug down on the windowsill and turned fully toward her. "We do the cleanup ourselves. We salvage what we can from the lower blocks for a rosé, something quick to market. We pivot. We don't try to make the vintage we planned, we make the vintage we can survive." Kendra stared at me, her guard dropping inch by inch. "That's insane. It's weeks of backbreaking labor. You didn't sign up for that." "I signed up for this," I corrected, gesturing between us. "I told you last night, I'm not here for the wine." The air thickened again, that familiar, magnetic pull tugging at my chest. She reached out, her hand hovering for a second before landing on my forearm. Her grip was firm, grounding. "Okay," she whispered. "A conspiracy of two." The weeks that followed were a blur of exhaustion and grit. We lived in mud. The professional hierarchy evaporated completely, replaced by the raw equality of physical labor. We spent 12 hours a day in the rows, cutting away the damage, hauling broken trellis wires, our boots heavy with clay. My hands, used to typing invoices, grew calloused and stained with soil. But it was in the quiet moments that the real shift happened. Passing a water bottle back and forth in the midday sun, our fingers brushing against the plastic, lingering just a second too long. The way she would look at me across the hood of the truck, sweat trailing down her neck, a silent acknowledgement of the partnership we were forging in the dirt. We were exhausted, aching, and terrified of the bank. But we were together. And every time our eyes locked over a pile of ruined vines, the promise of that midnight plea grew stronger, rooting itself deep in the earth we were trying to save. The mud became our entire world. It wasn't just soil anymore. It was a heavy, living adversary we wrestled with from dawn until the sun dipped behind the western ridge. The romantic notion of vineyard life, the sunlight on the leaves, the leisurely tastings, evaporated, replaced by the brutal reality of agriculture. We spent weeks knee-deep in the clay, pulling out the shattered remains of the vintage. My hands, once accustomed to the smooth plastic of a keyboard, grew rough and stained with earth that no amount of scrubbing could remove. But I wasn't working alone. Kendra was there for every minute of it, shedding the last remnants of her corporate shell to reveal the fighter underneath. She traded her tailored blazers for heavy flannel and canvas work pants that were perpetually coated in dust. Seeing her like this, sweat trailing down her neck as she hauled broken trellis wires, did something to the air between us. It stripped away the polish, leaving something raw and undeniable. We developed a rhythm, a silent language of movement. I would reach for a cutter, and she would already be handing it to me. I would stumble on a slick patch of clay, and her hand would be there to steady me, her grip strong and sure. The intimacy was in the shared exhaustion. It was in the way we passed a single water bottle back and forth under the midday sun, our fingers brushing against the warm plastic, my lips touching the rim where hers had just been. It was a slow burn, a low-frequency hum that grew louder with every day we spent sweating side by side. I'd catch her watching me across the rows, her gaze lingering on my arms as I drove a stake into the ground. She didn't look away when I caught her. Her gaze held mine, unflinching, her eyes dark and heavy, with a heat that had nothing to do with the sun. But the real danger wasn't in the fields. It was in the office, at midnight. We would retreat to the main house after 14 hours of labor, smelling of wet earth and ozone, to tackle the accounting. The physical exhaustion lowered our defenses, stripping away the professional boundaries we tried to maintain during the day. One night, the air in the small office felt particularly charged. The only light came from the desk lamp and the glow of the monitor, casting long, intimate shadows against the walls. I was leaning over her shoulder, pointing out a discrepancy in the supply costs. "We can trim the budget here," I said, my voice rough with fatigue. "If we switch suppliers for the bottles." Kendra didn't look at the screen. She turned her chair slightly, trapping me in the small space between her and the desk. She looked up, her face inches from mine. I could smell the day on her, the scent of rain, cedar, and the salt of her skin. It was intoxicating. The silence stretched, coiled tight and heavy. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then back up to my eyes, dilated and dark. "You're standing too close, Garrett," she whispered. But she didn't lean back. "I know," I replied. The pull was magnetic, a physical force urging me to close the gap, to taste the exhaustion and the desire on her lips. "We can't," she said, though her voice lacked any real conviction. Not until the ground is safe. I can't lose my focus now. I'm not asking you to, I said, though my hand twitched with the urge to touch her cheek. We held that pose for a long, agonizing moment, a sultry standoff where the restraint made the desire sharper, heavier. We were banking the fire, letting the pressure build, knowing that when we finally broke, it would be explosive. I slowly straightened up, the loss of proximity a physical ache. 2 days later, I found her standing in row 4 at sunrise. She wasn't looking at the mud anymore. She was staring at a single, vibrant burst of green, pushing through the gray wood of a vine we thought was dead. Look, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I stood beside her, our shoulders touching. The first green shoot, the signal that the winter was over, the signal that it was time to turn our attention to the things we had been waiting to grow. The green shoot was the permission slip. We didn't say it out loud, but the siege mentality broke the moment we saw life returning to row 4. That evening, Kendra didn't head to the office. She stood by the truck, tapping her keys against her thigh, looking at me with a breathless sort of expectancy. Get cleaned up, she said. We're leaving the valley. I froze. Leaving? Is there a supplier meeting? No meetings, she said, her voice dropping an octave. No suppliers, no spreadsheets, just us. Put on a suit, Garrett. I want to see you in something that isn't covered in clay. The drive to the coast took an hour. The silence in the car wasn't the heavy, exhausted silence of the last few weeks. It was anticipatory. We were crossing a border, leaving the war zone of the Vineyard behind to re-enter the world of the living. When we walked into the restaurant, a quiet, low-lit place overlooking the dark water, I felt like an imposter. My hands still felt the phantom weight of the pruning shears, but the air here smelled of brine and expensive wine. And then there was Kendra. Seeing her out of the work boots and flannel was a physical shock. She wore a dress the color of deep Merlot, something soft that moved with her. In the candlelight, the lines of exhaustion around her eyes seemed to have softened. She wasn't the boss. She wasn't the struggling farmer. She was just a woman sitting across from me, and the sight of her took the air right out of my lungs. Stop looking at the wine list like you're analyzing the markup, she teased, reaching across the white tablecloth to touch my hand. Her skin was warm, the contact deliberate. Force of habit, I admitted, lacing my fingers with hers. It feels strange, being civilians. We earned it, she said softly. The conversation shifted then. We didn't talk about the loan or the replanting schedule. We talked about the things that usually get buried under the noise of business. She told me about learning to sail with her father, about the terrifying freedom of the open ocean. I told her about the architecture degree I never used, about my obsession with structure. We were mapping new territory, not on the land, but in each other. The dinner felt like a slow exhale. I watched the way the candlelight caught the curve of her throat when she laughed, a real, full-throated laugh that I hadn't heard in years. It was intoxicating. The texture of the linen tablecloth under my fingertips felt impossibly smooth compared to the rough bark we handled daily. The tension that had been simmering in the office, the restraint we'd practiced in the fields, it was all still there, but it had changed. It wasn't desperate anymore. It was inevitable. It sat heavy in the air between us, a sultry promise waiting to be kept. The drive back was dark and quiet. The interior of the car felt like a capsule. I could feel her presence in the passenger seat, the heat of her leg just inches from the gear shift. Every time I shifted gears, my hand brushed the fabric of her dress, sending a jolt of electricity straight up my arm. When I pulled up to the main house, I cut the engine, plunging us into silence. We walked to the front door, the gravel crunching under our dress shoes. The porch light was off, the shadows wrapped around us. Kendra turned to face me, the key forgotten in her hand. Her eyes searched mine, unflinching in the darkness. "Garrett," she whispered. It wasn't a question. It was an arrival. "I'm not leaving tonight," I said, the words low and rough. "I'm done walking away." "Good," she breathed. She stepped in. There was no hesitation this time, no fear of the storm or the ruin. She placed her hands on my chest, feeling the heart that was hammering against my ribs. And then she reached up. Her mouth found mine, and the kiss wasn't tentative. It was acclaiming. It tasted of the red wine we'd shared and the months of waiting we'd endured. It was deep, slow, and devastatingly sure. The boundary didn't just dissolve. It burned away, leaving us standing in the ashes of our professional distance, finally real. Time acts differently in a vineyard. It isn't measured in hours or minutes, but in sugar levels, rainfall inches, and the slow, deliberate thickening of the vines. 2 years had passed since the storm that nearly erased us, and the land had healed. The scars on the hillsides were covered now by a canopy of vibrant, aggressive green. The vintage we were currently bottling, the Resurrection blend, a name the marketing team hated but Kendra insisted on, was testing higher than anything the estate had produced in a decade. The smell of fermentation was back in the air, but it wasn't the acidic stench of loss anymore. It was rich, yeasty, and thick with the promise of solvency. We were hosting the release party in the main barrel room. The air was cool and smelled of French oak and expensive perfume. The room was filled with the same distributors and critics who had written our obituary 2 winters ago. They were drinking our wine, laughing too loudly, and pretending they hadn't ignored Kendra's calls when the bank was threatening foreclosure. I stood near the reserve bar, watching the room. I wasn't just the assistant anymore, though my title hadn't officially changed on the door. I was the partner, in every sense that mattered, even if we kept the exact nature of our nights in the main house quiet. Then I saw him. Julian Vance, the regional distributor who had pulled his contract 3 days after the hailstorm, triggering the panic that almost drowned us. He was standing with Kendra near the center of the room, holding a glass of the Resurrection blend up to the light. He looked polished, successful, and entirely too comfortable. I moved through the crowd. I didn't rush, but I cut a straight line toward them. "Kendra," Julian was saying, his voice carrying that smooth, oily cadence of a man used to buying his way out of trouble. I have to admit, I was skeptical. When I heard you were trying to salvage the lower block, I thought it was a fool's errand. But this? He swirled the dark liquid. This is structure. This is elegance. You've outdone yourself, darling. You really are the Iron Queen. He hadn't seen me approach. He didn't even know I existed, except perhaps as the guy who refilled the glasses. Kendra didn't smile. She stood with her weight evenly distributed, her glass untouched in her hand. She saw me arrive, and her expression shifted. The professional mask slipped just a fraction, replaced by a look of intense, grounded warmth. "It wasn't a solo effort, Julian," she said, her voice cool and sharp enough to cut glass. Julian laughed, dismissive. "Oh, I know. You have a great crew. But vision? That's singular. That's you." Kendra took a step back. It was a small movement, but it changed the geometry of the circle. She moved until her shoulder was aligned with mine, a physical closing of ranks. She turned her body so she was no longer facing Julian head-on, but standing beside me, presenting a united front. "You're mistaken," she said, and the room seemed to quiet down around us. The vision wasn't mine. I was ready to sell the deed and walk away. I was standing in the mud, ready to quit. She reached out and took my hand. She didn't hide it. She laced her fingers through mine, her grip firm and claiming, right there in the middle of the crowded room. Garrett is the reason you're drinking that wine. He's the one who saw the path through the wreckage when I was too blind to see anything but the loss. Julian blinked, his gaze dropping to our joined hands, then back to my face. The realization hit him slowly. The understanding that he wasn't talking to the help. He was talking to the architect of his exclusion. "This is a partnership, Julian," Kendra continued, her voice ringing with a steel I hadn't heard in years. "And since you didn't have faith in the team when we were bleeding, I don't think you get to celebrate with us now that we've healed. We won't be renewing your distribution contract." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a power shift, tectonic and permanent. Julian opened his mouth, closed it, and then simply nodded, retreating into the crowd. Kendra squeezed my hand. "Let's go home," she whispered. "I'm done sharing our win with people who didn't help us fight for it." That night, the transition was official. There were no more separate apartments, no more staying over. We moved the last of my boxes into the master suite of the main house. As we unpacked, blending my books with hers, my clothes with hers, the final barrier dissolved. We had built a fortress out of mud and ruin, and now, finally, we were just living in it. Safe. Together. Untouchable. It happened again on a Tuesday in late October. The sky turned that familiar, bruised purple, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. I was in the kitchen when the first crack of thunder shook the window panes, a deep, resonant boom that vibrated in the floorboards. It was the same sound that had started the nightmare 3 years ago, the same violent percussion of ice against wood that had heralded the destruction of everything we thought we owned. But this time, I wasn't running into the dark. I walked up the stairs, the wood smooth and warm under my bare feet. The house felt solid around me, anchored deep in the earth we had fought to keep. I found Kendra in the bedroom. She wasn't pacing. She wasn't frantically checking weather reports or calling the insurance adjusters. She was standing by the large bay window, wrapped in a thick cashmere robe, watching the rain hammer against the glass. The storm was raging outside, wind screaming through the eaves, rain lashing the siding. But inside, the air was still and scented with lavender and the warmth of the radiator. I came up behind her, wrapping my arms around her waist, pulling her back against my chest. She leaned into me instantly, her body soft and relaxed. There was no tension in her shoulders, no vibration of panic. She was warm. "It sounds angry tonight," she murmured, her voice low and calm. Her hand came up to cover mine where it rested on her stomach, her fingers interlacing with mine. "Let it be angry," I whispered into her hair. "The harvest is in. The barrels are full. The roof is new. There is nothing out there that can take anything from us tonight." She turned in my arms, not breaking the contact, just shifting so she could look at me. The lightning flashed, illuminating her face in a stark, blue-white burst. In the past, that light would have revealed terror. Tonight, it just showed me the woman I loved, grounded, safe, and looking at me with a gaze that held nothing but peace. Her eyes were dark, reflecting the storm, but not holding it. "Do you remember?" she asked. She didn't have to specify what. "Every second," I answered. "I remember the mud. I remember the cold. I remember thinking you were going to break into 1,000 pieces right there in row 12. I did break," she corrected softly, her thumb tracing the line of my jaw, a familiar grounding touch. "That's the point. I broke open. If that storm hadn't stripped everything away, I would still be sitting in that office alone, pretending I didn't need anyone. I would still be the Iron Queen, ruling over a kingdom of dust and debt." She looked past me, out at the chaotic dark where the wind was stripping the last leaves from the oaks. The storm took the vintage, Garrett, but it gave me my life back. The rain intensified, a roar against the glass that would have once made our blood run cold. Now, it just emphasized the safety of the room. We were insulated. We were a closed circuit of warmth in a cold world. I pulled her closer, the contact between us electric, but settled. A deep, resonant hum of belonging that had replaced the frantic energy of our beginning. The contrast was visceral, the freezing violence outside against the sultry, quiet heat of the bedroom. "Come back to bed," I said, the invitation simple. "In a minute," she whispered, leaning up to kiss me. It was a slow, languid kiss, tasting of the peppermint tea she'd been drinking and the sheer, unadulterated relief of safety. I just want to watch it for a second longer. I want to look at the monster and know it can't touch us. We stood there for a while, wrapped in each other, watching the violence of the weather from the sanctuary we had built. The cold rain was just weather now. It wasn't a judgment. It wasn't a sentence. It was just rain, falling on soil that was strong enough to drink it in and turn it into something sweet. The morning broke with a clarity that stung. The storm had scrubbed the air clean, leaving the sky a piercing, impossible blue. We stood on the back porch with our coffee, the wood damp beneath our feet. The vines stretched out before us, row after unbroken row of strong, dark wood. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving, their roots deep in the soil we had turned with our own hands. I looked at Kendra. She was watching the sunrise, her face relaxed, her hand resting easily on the railing. I realized then that her plea that night in the rain hadn't been for a business partner. She hadn't asked me to save the vineyard. She had asked me to witness her. She had asked for connection in a world that only wanted her competence. She looked at me, smiling, and the green vines behind her blurred into a single image of resilience. She set her cup down and reached for my hand. We walked down the steps and into the mud, our boots sinking into the soft earth. We didn't speak. We just walked the rows, hands brushing, watching the light hit the leaves. Sometimes the storm has to destroy the crop to reveal the ground beneath. If you believe that love can grow in the wreckage, subscribe to follow the rest of the journey.